Don't wear the ring. I know it's very tempting. Yes, you will appear to disappear, but the dark riders, they'll know you're there. Yes, Lord Sauron has many spies.
Many spies have many eyes.
So let me explain to you what we're doing right now. 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, we did a pretty comprehensive show on the enduring appeal of the work of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings specifically. Right around that same time, unbeknownst to us, J.D. Vance was appearing on a podcast where he expressed his enthusiasm for Lord of the Rings. That wasn't particularly important at that moment. He was just the hillbilly elegy guy at the time. But things obviously have changed. Conditions on the ground have changed. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that The Lord of the Rings is important to the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party. Here to do that is Adam Wren, a national political correspondent from Politico, and the person, as far as I know, who kind of connected those dots, who somehow or other remembered that 3-year-old interview and connected it to Vance's current candidacy. So Adam Wren, welcome to our show.
Good to be with you.
So explain a little bit more about this. This is a podcast, and he's just being asked. We don't have the audio because the audio literally does not appear to exist anywhere in podcast world, but he's asked his favorite author, right? And that's what he comes back with?
Yeah, so J.D. Vance is sitting on an episode of the Grounded podcast, which is now defunct, but it was recorded by Representative Jim Banks, who is one of the closest Donald Trump allies in the House of Representatives. He represents a portion of northeastern Indiana and is running for U.S. Senate now and is likely to be the next senator from Indiana. He and Banks share provenance in Kentucky. Both of their families grew up there. They have a close friendship. Jim Banks sat at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee next to J.D. Vance in the Trump friends and family box. And so they have a friendship. And so this was a podcast interview. They actually share some staff as well. This was a podcast interview that happened back in 2021. And I remember listening to it and being sort of struck by Vance's fascination with Tolkien and also C.S. Lewis. He said on the podcast that he had a fascination with these English writers who were sort of in World War I and World War II, and in their texts were grappling with big questions about whether they should join war, just war theory, the nature of evil and good. And that interview stuck with me. And I would go on to profile J.D. Vance during his Senate run in Ohio, where I grew up about an hour and a half to the north from Middleton, in a small town called Belle Fountain, Ohio, born about a week after J.D. Vance. And for me, growing up in high school when the Lord of the Rings movies first came out, I was really, taken with them as well. And when I heard J.D. Vance say they shaped his worldview, I thought it was one of the most millennial things about him, because a generation of Americans, when these movies came out, were reintroduced to Tolkien and turned from the movies to his literature to read and immerse themselves in this high fictional world that he created.
Yeah, I should say that later in the show, you'll hear that I, a baby boomer, was incredibly immersed in the books at a very different time than you and J.D. Vance. But, in a way, this is also a little bit of a part of the nerd ascendance, I think, in American life. I mean, Obama, despite being very athletic and cool and all this kind of stuff, he's a huge nerd, and he's really into Game of Thrones. And I think it's kind of hard to imagine a major political figure in America prior to Obama, and now we have Vance, talking about stuff like that as though it had any relevance. Before that, it really was kind of confined and maybe a little bit condemned to a sort of a putative set of shelves in the back of the political bookstore, right? Serious people didn't talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is a high fantasy allegorical work of fiction that involves, rings of power and elves and wizards and, ring wraiths and places like Mordor. I mean, we know that J.D. Vance is also a fan of Magic the Gathering and, lived in what felt to him at the time a rather ostracized existence growing up in the conditions that he did, both in eastern Kentucky and south Southern Ohio. And so, it is sort of a revenge of the nerds here, where it's newly comfortable to talk about these things. When I was reporting this story, actually during the week of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, because I had to turn this rather quickly after Vance was the pick. And I reached out to his staff with sort of some of the reporting that I had. They didn't reject any of the underlying premises of the reporting or any of the underlying facts, acknowledging that Vance was fascinated by Lord of the Rings. What they did object to was sort of the idea for the illustration, which features him in sort of this, Gandalf-like hat, puffing a cigar with Mordor in the back.
No, a pipe, please.
Pipe. That's right, a pipe. And they sort of rejected that idea as sort of belittling to the most recent vice presidential pick. But it turns out that J.D. Vance was asked about this story just last week by a reporter for The Guardian in an extended interview. And while he hadn't yet read the story, he was taken, he said, with the illustration and really got a kick out of it. And so that was fun to hear.
He talks about it as informing his conservative worldview, as he puts it. And I think that's sort of an interesting challenge for everybody. I would say it informed my worldview as well. I'm not a conservative. And in fact, I would have pointed out to him that, Sauron had this thing called Project 3941, which is the overhaul of the elvish bureaucracy. The plan included the reclassification of tens of thousands of Rivendell employees under a proposed Schedule F to facilitate easier firing and hiring personnel aligned with Mordor values. That should actually somewhat alarm, somebody like me anyway, and I don't know why that doesn't bother him. But on a more serious note, it's weird to start mapping politics onto something like that, right? You like it for the reasons that seem to be the values that seem to be contained in it. And so to hear that, it informed my ex-political beliefs, I sort of wonder about that. What's your take?
Yeah, as I was reporting this story, I realized that there is actually a connection to this in a number of far-right circles across the globe. And the Italian prime minister is fascinated by the Lord of the Rings and goes so far as to take part in cosplay, dressing up, as characters in the Tolkien universe. But really, I did talk to a literature professor who had actually spent time with J.D. Vance talking about his love of Tolkien. And, she told me that a number of people, sort of misinterpret or read in their own politics into Tolkien's work. And really, in some ways that's the mark of good fiction, is that it allows you to sort of inhabit multiple worldviews. But there is some tension with some of the takeaways from this that far right people take, and Tolkien's own stances. I mean, he was against the rise of Nazism and against authoritarianism, and spoke out and wrote out against those things, and thought that even the pursuit of power was a corrupting influence. And so, for someone who is in a position to occupy the second most powerful position, in the world, arguably, there's some tension there with Tolkien's work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about all this is that Tolkien. Well, two things. One of them is Tolkien's thesis, that kind of at the heart of Lord of the Rings is the best weapon is the one that you don't use. The Ring of Power is the most powerful thing in Middle-earth, but the only way for virtue to prevail is for nobody to use it and for it ultimately to be destroyed. I can't help but note that you and I are recording this conversation the day after Elon Musk and Donald Trump had their conversation, where Musk said basically that Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't as scary as people think because the cities are now up and running, as he says, full cities again. I mean, he was actually kind of suggesting, wow, maybe it wasn't that bad. The idea of restraint of power is a wonderful idea in Tolkien. You kind of hope that anybody who likes Tolkien would embrace it. I don't know what question I'm asking you, but pretend I asked you a question.
No, and I think that's right. And I think your mention Elon Musk and the Silicon Valley tech elite is timely. I mean, we know that Vance's mentor, Peter Thiel, the venture capitalist who he interacted with significantly and who in many ways started his venture capital firm, was also deeply interested in Tolkien and, has named some of his venture capital firms, including the first one that Vance worked at, Mithril Capital, after, a Tolkien universe nomenclature. And so we know that this interest in Tolkien goes, throughout Silicon Valley, and Vance's ability to raise money from people like Elon Musk and bring the Elon Musks of the world into the Trump fold, speaks to this fascination with Tolkien that has long outlasted him.
Yeah, one of the other things that I wonder about too, and I don't think this will ever come to the surface, and I don't think it necessarily pertains to J.D. Vance, but the original telling of Lord of the Rings, the novels, and for that matter, the Peter Jackson movies, the first round of those, it's a pretty white story. And in fact, in the books, I'm pretty sure the only beings whose skin color is ever mentioned, everybody else being kind of implicitly white, are the orcs, who are supposed to be kind of dark skinned. And I do wonder, as we have the new Amazon Prime series where you have elves of color, you have a lot of beings of Middle Earth, or there's just a lot more DEI, as the Republicans like to complain about, in the new one. It almost seems like the kind of thing that culture warriors might turn to at some point and saying, wow, they're trying to make my favorite book or movie into something it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the criticism of Tolkien and the people who were part of his milieu, people like C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicle of Narnia series, there is some modern day criticism of how they handled issues of multiculturalism and race, looking back onto their own views. And so, it's not surprising for us to read in those same criticisms and also to respond with sort of a more diverse universe of characters, as you allude to in the Prime series. But yeah, these were people of their day who were wrestling with big questions of mortality. In some ways, it feels like we are so far removed from that world. But on the brink of global unrest, it's something that we could find ourselves ushered back into. And I think really what Vance took from his reading of Tolkien was that there are forces of good and evil in the world. And he took a certain apocalypticism that I think we've seen in some of his approach to campaigning so far, that is very clearly connected to his reading of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of both the virtue and perhaps the flaw of Lord of the Rings as a text that people map onto, which is once you decide who's good and who's evil, there's only really one acceptable outcome, at least in Tolkien's world. The problem is, of course, we don't all agree about which side is which, and that's maybe a source of alarm. But speaking of that also, I think one of the really interesting themes in Lord of the Rings, and it gets right at the ring, is that people change, and they can be changed for the worse. The whole idea, whether we're talking about Saruman or Gollum, or anybody who wears the ring or covets the ring, gets too interested in the ring, it turns them, it changes them. It is power that corrupts, and corrupts absolutely. And you just wonder whether people who like Tolkien, I'm sure he's a smart guy. I'm sure he gets that in the book. I wonder if we all get it as well when it's about ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the own transformation that Vance has gone through from someone who is violently anti-Trump, comparing him to Hitler and to an opioid in 2016 when his book Hillbilly Elegy came out, to now someone who says that Trump represents the forgotten working class. There's been for him sort of a pursuit of power that, whether you call it good or evil, is certainly incontrovertible. I mean, in 2016, the kinds of people that he were courting were against Trump, and now the kinds of people that he is courting are for Trump. And really, the only thing that's changed is sort of who has the power and the cultural cachet. And so I think that you can see ways in which that pursuit of power has reshaped Vance, just as, the search for the rings in the book has reshaped some of the characters that we've come to know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very comfortable with somebody in a seat of power asking him or herself, what would Gandalf do? The only doubt I have is whether they're going to come up with the right answer or not. But Adam Wren is a national political correspondent for Politico. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
And we're going to take a little break. We'll come back. We're going to share with you some more of that 3-year-old show where we talked about Tolkien in a much more general way.
When darkness falls, your heart will be true. You walk a lonely road. Oh, how far.
So if that already creates some kind of Pavlovian reaction in you, then you already know what we're talking about. We are talking about Lord of the Rings, the entire legendarium, also, as they say, of J.R.R. Tolkien. So give me, 180 seconds. I think I can do this. Just give you my little personal story. So sometime in the late 60s, like a lot of people who were sort of hippie adjacent, I was a high school student at the time at a boys' school, and a friend of mine, Bruce Moeller, I think he was reading The Hobbit, and I was kind of making fun of him. I didn't know what it was exactly, but he was telling me what it was, and then I was making fun of him. And then somehow or other, he got me to read it, and I was enchanted by it, and then got started on the Lord of the Rings books, which had been published about 15 years earlier. And to say that I was transported, well, like millions and millions of readers, I was transported. And I read them many times after that, and then got kind of more selective. I would just read all the parts that I liked and skipped over the parts that I didn't like, but kind of made my way through it probably 5 or 6 times over the years in that very selective way. And then towards the end of my really most obsessive period, and well before the movies, I would read one chapter, which was one of the last, essentially the end of the book, called The Scouring of the Shire, when the hobbits come back and they've acquired this whole new skill set, and things are in moral disrepair in their home. So this all culminates in a day that must have been somewhere around 1999. So there's no movies out. I've read the books a long time ago, and I'm hiking with 2 10-year-old boys, one of whom is my son. And we're in the White Mountains, and the whole idea is to hike up 4,000 feet to get over the Alpine line so you can see where the huts are and stuff. And with 10-year-old boys, hiking is kind of boring. Climbing up a trail is kind of boring. And so mutiny is always a possibility. So I began to tell them the story of Lord of the Rings, which, to my surprise, I remembered in great detail. And, of course, I was sort of Scheherazade at any point. If I ran out of story, they would murder me. But it worked, and they were completely enchanted by it. And I was unsurprised when the movies finally did come out that everybody else was enchanted too. We are going to talk about all the manifestations of the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. And we're going to start with John Garth, the author of The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, the places that inspired Middle-earth and Tolkien and the Great War, among other books. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. A lovely story, by the way.
Well, we made it, too. We made it up above the Alpine line, and I was not murdered. So, obviously. So, maybe just for beginners and for beginnings, just give us a thumbnail sketch of the man and his story. Who is this person who created this body of work?
Well, he used to be seen, I think, primarily as an Oxford professor. So an expert in languages. He taught English language and literature right back to the Old English epic poem Beowulf, and specializing in Old English, Middle English, the language of Chaucer, Old Norse, the language of the Norse myths. My aim with my first book, Tolkien and the Great War, was to kind of reposition him as a war veteran, because he was also a soldier in the Battle of the Somme. And he ran signals for a battalion of about 700 men through this most appalling of battles. then there, of course, there are other aspects to him which are equally important. He had a very, very tight family, strong bonds, and very, very close friendships with people, including C.S. Lewis, who later went on to write the Narnia books, I think heavily influenced by Tolkien there. Tolkien was an orphan. His father died when he was 4. His mother died when he was 12. So put that together with the First World War, and you can see that he was well acquainted with mortality, and that kind of hangs in the background of his books. And he kind of, because of that experience in the war and all the technological change that was going on at the time, the cultural, societal changes, he kind of straddles old worlds and new worlds, I think, so that although people tend to think of him as just being stuck in the past, a terrible nostalgist, I think he was really kind of constantly in dialogue about the need to adapt versus the need to preserve. And you see this played out in The Lord of the Rings, for example, with the elves who are desperate to preserve things of the past, almost to their own downfall.
Meditating a bit on him this morning, I mean, anytime you think of a person like this, you think of something new. And I was thinking about the fact that, yes, he had all of this incredible body of lore and legend and folklore to draw upon. And he does. And this is a very syncretistic work. It's sort of bringing together a lot of ideas from a lot of legends, but also, and there are names that, like Gandalf, that occur elsewhere that he brings in. But he also does something that I think is not, for the most part, present in a lot of those very heroic legends. And that is that Bilbo and Frodo are more David Copperfield type characters. They are us. They are not outwardly special. They have no basis for thinking of themselves as heroes or being thought of that way by others. And you don't see that as much in the old source legends. We can point to certain exceptions. There are examples. You could even point, I think, to the disciples in the New Testament. They are also rather ordinary and flawed people who have to kind of gain strength and exceed their own limitations. But mostly, what I think, and particularly pondering your work too, is, I mean, they're him, right? He had as a boy the experience of feeling small and helpless and kind of over-challenged by life. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, and also as a young adult, going off into the wide world, into a world war, which is essentially what the Hobbits and the Lord of the Rings do. So he did actually write a very mythologically templated body of stories from the First World War onwards, which he came to call the Silmarillion, in which there are no hobbits. And that these stories are very much on the epic level of myth, and that's really the only level they're on. The great marvel of The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit too, of course, is the hobbits themselves. And they came along sort of by accident, because his desire to tell stories about ancient myth, or create his own ancient myths, collided with his desire to entertain his children. And to entertain his children, he created hobbits who are much like himself, or like the people that he knew when he was the age his sons now were. So these were based on people of the late Victorian era, the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century. And that's what you see plunged into this very sort of medieval world. And they work for us because we can identify with them. We can see through their eyes and feel through them how strange and marvelous and terrifying this world is.
There's a common term these days in the world of science fiction and fantasy of world building. That term I don't think was around, not that way anyway, at the time that he's writing this work. But he's really, such a pioneer at it, right? The people who had to tell the Arthurian tales, they didn't have to invent that world. It was sort of there to be taken. I mean, they had to add their own fancy and plot to it. But he really assembles this world. I mean, in terms of its geography, its topography, its languages, its songs, its landscape. I mean, everything is, as I understand it, he kind of built that world first and then populated it. Is that correct?
Well, no, it was a bit more organic than that. But what actually came first was the language. So he invented languages from childhood. that was his passion. He had this extraordinary sensitivity towards the sounds of language and wanted to emulate his favorite languages by inventing ones in their mode. And also he knew he understood how languages evolve. So, British English and American English, for example, we can hear right now sound different because they have evolved in different directions over a few centuries. Take that further, and in a world where there's no global intercommunications and languages diverge faster. Tolkien wanted his invented languages to have their own histories and their own speakers and stories that they could tell, that they could embody. He wanted characters, peoples, places that he could use his languages to name. And this is actually one of the keys, I think, to his aura of originality, which almost runs counter to the very strong sense we have of these being really, primal myths that we recognize. The trick was he did take from Norse mythology, from Greek mythology, from Celtic mythology, from English legend and so forth, and he mixed things up. But because he had these invented languages, he was able to put all these mixed, synthesized things under new names, and therefore that they seemed deeply original at the same time as seeming deeply sort of archetypal.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of there from the beginning of the stories. I mean, it's certainly people, if you've only seen the movies, still that the ring gets thrown into the fireplace at Bag End, and out it comes with this elvish writing on the side of it. And I think Gandalf reads it aloud in this very incantatory way. And these languages are very much woven into the plot. They're not freestanding. I mean, another thing he does is that his characters sing a lot. So I've been challenged, as we were preparing for this show, I happened to mention that, sometimes if I'm reading this to a child or recently I was reading it to someone who's quite ill, if I'm reading these books and I come to a song, I'll often sing the song, and it turns out that in my head I have made up tunes for these songs. So Lily Tyson said that I should sing one here. I'll do 4 lines of one here. Here we go. Sing hey for the bath at the close of the day that washes the weary mud away. A loon is he that will not sing. Oh, water hot is a noble thing. So forgive me for that. So I think this is another part of it, right? That the old lays, the old stories, the sagas, the skalds, a lot of those were sung too. And I assume that's part of why he wants his characters to sing occasionally.
Yes, I think so. But also, he came from a singing culture. First World War soldiers sang as they marched along the road. The Hobbits do that. And he studied, medieval literature that had all sorts of things other than, epic poems. They had medieval hymns, lyrics, just folk songs. And he was a craftsman. He was a craftsman in language. He loved the challenge of writing words that would fit to a singable rhythm, a chantable rhythm, often very complex, sometimes really simple, to suit the scenario, to suit the people who are singing it. And this is one of the many ways in which he embeds this very sort of 3-dimensional sense of culture in Middle-earth. I want to just go back to the end of the question that I failed to answer last time, which is that he did this. He built the world as he went along, and he kept tinkering with it. He kept injecting new things into it. So one of the things was the poems. He would sometimes write poems for entirely different reasons, and they would be drawn into the orbit of Middle-earth and embedded into the Lord of the Rings.
Right, and the characters in Lord of the Rings will sometimes share these poems or lays or sagas to kind of make sense of their current situation. And, there's an old story that's like this. I'm thinking of, I think it's Beren, there's an old story that helps explain the situation that we're in right now, which is exactly how those kinds of stories are used in real life and in real culture.
And can I just say,
Yeah.
I mean, that is actually Tolkien in a nutshell, because there's a wonderful conversation between Frodo and Sam where Sam says, don't the great tales never end?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're still inside that same story that Beren and Luthien were in. And there's very long, the millennia of history between them, but there's a continuous thread of events that joins them. And I think Tolkien felt that his work was a similar kind of part of a thread that joins us to ancient literature.
You know, you talked before about Tolkien kind of straddling two sensibilities, you know, the sensibility of his moment and the sensibility of the past. There's a way in which I think he's different. There are a lot of ways in which he's different from the modern sensibility, but I would argue, and feel free to put me in my place, but I wouldn't say that he had no sense of humor, but he has no sense of comedy and no ironic detachment from the work, the way almost everything has to have these days. In other words, this is a very, very serious story. There are some comic people in the story and some little bit of comic relief there, but not in an ironic way that doesn't take the situation seriously. When you look at the movies, you know, there's an exchange, for example, Gimli, they're up on the wall, and Gimli says, "What's happening out there?" And Legolas says, "Shall I describe it to you, or would you like me to find you a box?" I can't imagine his characters saying that to one another because it's too comic, right? It departs too much from the import of the moment. I don't know. What's your take?
I think Gimli is kind of, they've taken sort of R2-D2 and C-3PO there a bit, haven't they, to just have a comic duo. No, that's not in Tolkien. There are characters who, particularly hobbits, who respond to things with humor. There are characters, particularly hobbits, whom Tolkien pokes fun of. The opening chapter of The Lord of the Rings is satirical, really, about this fatuous society of self-indulgent people. You know, it's not. Some people think he just adores hobbits. No, I don't think so. I think he has very mixed feelings about them. But it's very important that he is not an ironist at heart. He lived in a generation that was overwhelmed by irony because of the First World War, because of the sense that all those pre-war values of honor and patriotism and courage and so on were vitiated in the trenches. They were rendered worthless because you couldn't show those things without in that kind of environment of appalling passive suffering and inability to act. So I think Tolkien was aware of that, and you see some of that in Lord of the Rings, in the journey of Frodo into Mordor, where he becomes more and more afflicted, you might say psychologically, and less able to act. It's Sam who helps him along. It's a real kind of officer and officer's servant relationship. But on the other hand, you see very sort of non-ironical, very serious treatments of medieval-style action scenes, battles with flags waving and horns blowing, and tremendously moving. If you laugh at it, then you've missed the enchantment of the book completely.
I would agree. I also think it's one of his real marvels is the way that he is able to toggle between this almost claustrophobic experience of the two hobbits plus Gollum going into Mordor and getting into these all horrible, once again, claustrophobic situations and the loneliness of all that with the other thing with the great epic sweep and there's a lot of swashbuckle in all the stuff that's kind of dominated by Aragorn and Legolas and Gandalf and Gimli. He does it so well. I wanted to ask about one last thing before we run out of time, and I'm going to start with in March of 1958. Tolkien attempted a Hobbit dinner at a bookstore in Rotterdam, Netherlands, where they served Lord of the Rings-inspired dishes like maggot soup. I'll pass, thank you. And he offers a toast. He says, "I look east, west, north, south, and I do not see Sauron, but I see that Saruman has many descendants. We hobbits have against them no magic weapons, yet by gentle hobbits I give you this toast to the hobbits. May they outlast Sarumans and see spring again in the trees." And there's a way in which, for all the fun that it gives us and all the, thrills and spills and excitement that it gives us and drama, there's something very moral about all this, right? It really ultimately is the story about a bunch of somewhat cosseted creatures who grow up, eating mini meals a day, 11s and second breakfasts and whatever they're called, and who have to toughen up and who have to kind of take on these big challenges. And then when they get back from their journey, they have to fix their home, which is also slid into moral disrepair. And in a way, one senses that this man, having lived as he did through World War I and World War II at that point, he's got something kind of serious, I think, that he's trying to say, and it's there in that toast. I mean, what do you hear in that toast?
Yes, he wants us to take away a sense of hope, perseverance in a world that is full of evils and hardships, and to be very skeptical, I think, of power, or organized power, corruption in organizations and in individuals, and the impact that they can have on people and on the planet. I mean, it didn't speak in terms of the planet, obviously, but the natural world is really at the heart of Tolkien's creativity. So that's, I think, one of the great messages. I do think that Tolkien's been a big influence on the environmental movement.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. All right. We have to stop there. It has been so much fun to talk to you and so enlightening to talk to you. We've been talking to John Garth, the author of The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Places That Inspired Middle-earth, and Tolkien and the Great War, among other books. We will take a break. We will come back. We will go to the movies. First of all, some words of thanks to Eugene Amatruda and Kat Pastor, both of them serving as technical producers on different parts of this show. Lily Tyson, our senior producer, is the producer of this particular episode. Now, in 2021, we had a conversation with Susana Polo, entertainment editor for Polygon. It was 20 years since the first Lord of the Rings movie had been released. Susana was editing Polygon's The Year of the Ring, as well as writing articles as part of it. We started by hearing from Susana her memories of the movies coming out.
The movies are coming out all through the period in which I was in high school, which will just firmly date me for the whole audience. And I'd already read the books, but my brother, who's much younger than I am, wasn't old enough to read them yet. And so we spent all 3 of those years reading the books out loud to him, which was a great sort of education and contrast. And I think, like most people, I was, obviously immediately taken with this great epic visual and audio sort of extravaganza of just taking the story very seriously and not really worrying that anybody might think it was silly to be following a bunch of barefoot guys around New Zealand.
Well, that's a reductionist way of talking about it anyway. So, yeah, we should talk about some of the things that are great about the movies. Like I would argue, actually, we could play a clip to illustrate what I think is maybe the best thing for me about the movies. So let's hear B1 Cap.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring. In which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
So, I don't know, Susana, for me, having read those books many times and imprinted them like the baby duck that I was, it says something that now my idea of Gandalf is Ian McKellen. I mean, he took something that was immortal and iconic on the page and made it him, which I think is a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, and I think the choice of actors for the Lord of the Rings movies, I think, cannot be understated. It's this wealth of a lot of people that we consider household names now who, Orlando Bloom was plucked out of film school. Elijah Wood was, kind of, considered to be like I think he was just aging out of like being a child actor at the time. And then you have this whole wealth of character actors and guys from British theater who walk in the room and they put on their Theoden costume or their Denethor costume. They go, oh, I see. Yes, I'm Lear. This is a fantasy world. But what I'm doing here is I am holding all of the gravitas of this fantasy society on my shoulders, and I'm going to make the audience believe that I am grieving my son and that I have deep grief over how my lands have been corrupted and I have been swayed, and to communicate that in very few scenes and immortalize these characters. And I think that's a testament in part to that, blockbusters today tend to, you look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and they wink a lot. Mm-hmm. They let the audience in on how, we know this is kind of silly, he's a guy dressing up like a bat. Mm-hmm. And isn't it theatrical? But the Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson's and all the production on the Lord of the Rings was very much, they talk all the time in their special features about the movies. Our attitude was we were making a historical drama and we were taking it all very seriously and it was going to be earnest. And I think that attitude is really what holds up the audience suspension of belief and gets you invested in everything that's happening.
Right. There are times where that resolve weakens and maybe even falters and crumbles. And I think the movies pay a big price. I would say maybe the worst example of that is the dwarf tossing joke at Helm's Deep. That's a very modern joke. First of all, it's a joke. And as you just said, and we said in the first segment, Tolkien didn't make ironic jokes about his material for exactly the reason that you just said. To me, that was a very weak choice. It's also a little bit offensive to, we know what dwarf tossing is in other situations too. I was kind of surprised. I guess you make that many hours of film, you're going to make some human mistakes, huh?
Well, sure. And I'm certainly I'm on the team of Gimli's a little too silly in the movies. I am a big fan of dwarves in fantasy in general, and I would like to see a little bit more respect given. I would disagree with you that I think he is kind of a comedy character in the books, but not because he's too silly, because he's very stubborn and grumpy. And I think Tolkien often leans into that to get Gimli in arguments with people like Éomer or Elrond, or to get Gimli a little nervous when Legolas gets very excited about the forest that has just showed up outside of Helm's Deep and wants to ride right into it and say hello to the trees. And Gimli doesn't understand why we should be riding right into this haunted forest.
So I'll give you I have a list of gripes about the movies, although I do like them quite a bit. I'll give you just one other, although just as long as we're mentioning Gimli. Really, they got a $770 kajillion budget. They can't hire two separate actors for Gimli and Treebeard, but that's a separate issue. My gripe is about the third movie, where, in fact, this army of the dead, which can harm but cannot be harmed, shows up for what is the kind of epic climactic battle. And kind of just changes the odds so drastically that it really robs it, I think, of its heroic content. That does not happen in the books. And when I watched that, I thought, oh, well, Aragorn and everybody else, they're kind of over-assisted at this point where it's not even a fair fight. I thought that was a really bad decision.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm with you on they're having some problems with The Return of the King, if we want to get real fanish about it. I love the Lord of the Rings movies. They're very, sort of central to my growing up. I've never quite given. If I met Peter Jackson, I would shake his hand and I would love to chat with him. But I don't think I've forgiven him for cutting the Scouring of the Shire out of the movies. And I understand there's only so much time, and movies are a different artistic language than novels. But I still feel just very centrally that that's the whole ending of the story.
It totally is. And it's
at its heart, The Lord of the Rings is not an overt, it is always a little bit of a tragedy.
Yep.
And when you remove the Scouring, it removes a lot of that. But we wanted to talk about the movies, and I don't want to get too much into going back to the books.
I wanted to also talk to you about, so when you were you were in high school and you had read the books. So you read the books, and the books, they don't have the book's strong women characters. Galadriel is the closest thing. In 1954, the Scottish poet Edward Muir started reviewing the books, and by 1955, when he wrote about Return of the King, he said all the characters are boys masquerading as adult heroes and will never come to puberty. Hardly one of them knows anything about women. And so for the movies, Jackson's got to do something, right? It can't be that way. And so he beefs up the role of Arwen. He gives it to Liv Tyler. He makes a stronger character among the Rohirrim. I don't know. Give us your thoughts about all that.
I think it's definitely a very important sort of part of translating Tolkien's work to film. And if only because, throwing Glorfindel in there for like 10 minutes, yes, you should just give that to a character that the viewers are actually going to remember and need to be introduced to, like Arwen. But I think I go back and forth on Éowyn. I think is a really big touchstone for women and female identifying people who watch the Lord of the Rings movies. And I think that she's also a really nuanced example of Tolkien's feelings on women that were different from sort of, we look at his contemporary C.S. Lewis, who are writing, that Aslan telling Susan that war is only truly ugly when women are involved, and Éowyn, when you really dig into her character in the books, her arc isn't about how women aren't allowed to fight in the Rohirrim. It's about how she is a member of the royal family, and her uncle and her brother they're war leaders. They have to go off to fight, and that leaves her as the only other member of the royal family who has to stay at home with the people who do not go off to fight. And her problem with that is not that she feels that it's unworthy or that it's necessarily sexist. It's that she wants a noble death. Everybody at that point of the Lord of the Rings believes that the world is ending, and she doesn't want to die defending, speared by a hearth. She wants to die in glorious battle with her family. And she only gets over that once she accepts the idea that there might be a future and that there might be something other to hope for. She might be able to hope for something in her life other than just choosing the manner of her death. And that's something much more nuanced than, I want to, anything you can do, I can do better. Mm-hmm. And it's, like Tolkien also has other female characters outside of the Lord of the Rings, which obviously don't get into the movies, but he has, and even in his own life, he, because he married so young and became a professor so young, he was put in the position of being a married professor who could, without freaking people out, could mentor female students. And he wound up mentoring a lot of young women who were going to Oxford and taking English and, studying English, who became very close family friends. And so he was not, we think of, as your last guest was saying, we think of him as being this very old fashioned guy, but he was very much in the position that women should be educated. Women can do things that men can do. But he also, and I think this speaks to, sort of the read of the Lord of the Rings as being about boys who never reach puberty, is that he also in his personal life felt, that he, maybe he and his wife didn't necessarily need to have a lot of interests in common, that they loved each other very much, but their relationship was built on putting a house together and building a family together and loving each other, not necessarily having the same intellectual pursuits. And he also very much valued like male company. And so you can sort of see that, and you can see both of those things in Lord of the Rings, right? You can see
Absolutely.
Sort of Éowyn having these goals that aren't really, that isn't, when you dig into it, isn't necessarily about the equality between the sexes, but about this greater theme of what war and battle and being a warrior is. And then you also have this story that has just very, very few female characters in it, and that is very much about relationships between men, whether that is brothers, friends, the king or the leader, and the people who look up to him, just examining those relationships.
Susana Polo, entertainment editor for Polygon. Check out the whole package they've got there. It's really pretty incredible. All right, and it's time for me to go home and say to my dog, I'm back. I'm back. But the road goes winding ever on. We'll be doing other shows for you, and we've got one on the next day and many days after that.